Hey everybody, here's this Agile thing. My name is Matt Beam.
I'm Mike Markey.
And I'm Jeff Singleton.
And we are here to talk today about the concept of the mental model.
The mental model. You know something? You have talked about mental models off and on for like weeks. Anyone who's been listening to this has gone, like at some point during every broadcast, Matt goes, well, you know, I'm just going to bring up mental models again. And you know what? I still don't know what you mean when you say mental models. And I don't think everyone here knows what you mean when you say mental models. Maybe Jeff knows. Maybe I know more than I'm letting on. But I don't know that all of our listeners are aware of what mental models are.
Well, I feel a little bit attacked, but shall I expound on mental models?
Please.
Okay.
Please expound.
So I've got some stuff here.
Educate us.
Oh boy, that's hard. So I got this from Wikipedia, and I came across this when I started reading Steve Tendon's book called The Book of Tame Flow. He's got an interesting approach that's obviously outside the scope of this, but he spends a fair amount of time in the beginning talking about mental models because they are really, really impactful in terms of what the nature and the scope and the effectiveness of the change is going to be if you're in doing something like a transformation or trying to help evolve the ways of working. And so the mental models of the leaders is what he talks about because...
Okay, so we can accept that statement that the mental models of the leaders is important. But what is a mental model?
Yeah, I was just going to... I got a part here that's highlighted. So.
I'm just seeding you questions.
Oh, awesome. That's awesome. So a mental from Wikipedia, it's an explanation of someone's thought process about how something works in the real world. It's a representation of the surrounding world, relationships between the various parts, and a person's intuitive perceptions about their own acts and their consequences. So there's a quote that Al Shiloh uses about, who was it? I can't remember who it was, but the way that we see the problem is the problem. I think that's Stephen Covey, right? And so the idea is people have this understanding of how stuff works or should work, and they go about, trying to fix perceived problems according to that understanding. It's kind of like the idea of if your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail, right? Because your mental model is that stuff needs to be pounded on to get it fixed. And so
because you know all about hammers.
Yeah. Right. And you don't know anything about wrenches, right? When you might have a threaded rod with a nut on it, in which case you're going to hammer on the threaded rod because your mental model is inappropriate. That's essentially why I thought it was interesting.
So a mental model is the way that we take the things we observe in the world and we try to make sense out of it.
Yeah, I think it's like a lens, the lens that we see the world through.
Okay. And we all have seen different things, and we all have different ways of interpreting the inputs. So you could have two, 3, 4 people all applying a different mental model to the same symptom.
Yes, and even worse, you could have 2 or 3, 4 applying. I'm sorry, did you say the same mental model?
No, different.
Different mental models. Yes, exactly. And in fact, that tends to be the problem is that we assume that we've got a similar mental model, and we don't recognize that the thrashing is based on the fact that we have different understandings of what the cause and effect is supposed. We make different productions and don't understand that.
And maybe to illustrate this without getting specific as we did in the pre-show discussion, but we were talking about the way that someone in our space thinks about the world, interprets the way that somebody else is doing something. And when they describe these actions, there's a almost negative connotation to the actions that they see.
Totally.
But when you take it from the other side and you're listening to the person who's actually being talked about, they're saying the exact same symptoms, but they're attributing a different motivation to it.
Totally.
And they're both ways of looking at the problem. One of them, one could argue, is probably a little more accurate. The other.
Or useful, because there's this idea that all models are wrong, but some of them are useful, right? I mean, because the models are all reductions of the complexity of reality, right? And so what you're saying is you're abstracting out what's interesting or what's the defining characteristics of this thing, and you're focusing on that, right?
Well, we're natural pattern matchers.
Totally.
Right? right? So as soon as something you see fits into one of your mental models, because you should have more than one if you are a well-meaning, sane individual. You shouldn't be going around.
Even
only
if you're
thinking-
insane.
But you should have. You're right. Let's not get into mental health yet.
Yeah.
Later, we'll talk about ChatGPT, and then we'll talk about mental.
I refuse to
mental
go near
health,
that thing, but it's
Oh my gosh. Let's see. How do we got to 9
Yeah.
minutes before?
So
exactly.
I'm just saying from past experience, the pattern has been that we will land. In
Mike's
AI
Mike's
at
mental
some-
model of this show is that it's heavily weighted towards ChatGPT talk.
It's a pattern that we have repeated.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Okay. Anyway, but that's neither here nor there. What we are talking about is you see something, you see a behavior, you see an act in the world, it matches something in your brain, and you pick one of the mental models in your head that describes that or makes sense out of it to you, and then you act based on that.
Would it
in
help-
the blink of an eye.
Totally, without even reflecting on the appropriateness of this model and whether another one maybe should be. But so, would it help to give a specific, concrete example?
Please do.
Probably would.
Please say yes. Okay. So imagine you're a leader in an organization and you go into the, not to pick on leaders, but you go into the cafeteria and you see the senior architect just sitting there at a table. He's looking out the window. She's looking out the window. And you make a note of it and you walk past and you come back and you come back 13 minutes later and you see the same person still looking out the window. Now, some leaders, imagine you've got the mental model of full utilization.
Mm-hmm.
Right? In other words, we're paying these people this amount of money and we expect this output. And the model that you might have is knowledge work is mechanical, or you need to be doing something, right? You need to be busy. I need to be able to. Right? You might get upset because it looks like that person is daydreaming. You don't understand. You might think that they're not working, right? The mental model of that senior architect might be, boy, I need to think about this really deeply. This is a really hard problem. I need some dedicated.
And I need to step away from my desk. I need to just go somewhere else.
Yeah.
I know somebody who does that with a shower. But
That would be inappropriate work. But I'm just saying, like, focusing on the people versus focusing on the system, right? You could think of those as two different mental models. Focusing on full utilization versus focusing on the flow of the work through the system. So if your mental model is full utilization, you're upset that somebody doesn't seem to be doing any work. And if your mental model is focused on what's the cycle time of work that flows through the system, and you know that the cycle time is good or improving, and you see, like, apparently this is what the senior architect needs to do to ensure that flow remains acceptable. So,
Right.
go ahead and apparently that helps them do their job, whatever.
Or an example we've used in the past. If you have the mental model, I'm applying now the mental model language to it, though. If you have the mental model that if there is an emergency, people should be panicking about it,
Yes.
and you walk into a scrum room and see a team on a break in the afternoon, they've been working all day. They're taking a few minutes off, maybe telling a joke, maybe playing a game, maybe doing something, and that doesn't fit your mental model of what they should be doing. There's an emergency, therefore there should be panic, and they get mad that there is no visible panic, or as they would put it, a sense of urgency.
Totally.
Okay, so
Totally. My first job in software, like at the team level, was at this place, and we had a ping pong table in the room, and we would play ping pong, and they would pay us for it. And I was a little bit perplexed by that.
You still got paid even though you were playing ping pong.
The understanding was you could get up and play ping pong whenever you wanted to, and there was no allocation of number of games per day for ping pong. What they cared about was, does the thing work? Did you meet your commitments? Is the customer happy? And so I got used to, that was my idea of Agile, right? Mm-hmm. And then I went and I left to other places with different mental models. And the suggestion of a ping pong table was like, that's not the real world. You don't understand how this works. And I just thought, boy, that's
I was at one
fascinating.
place, we got a pool table, we got a dartboard, but everyone was terrified to use it.
Yeah, by God, you shouldn't use it lest you get observed playing.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Yeah, because one of the problems with mental models and changing mental models is you can introduce them, but that doesn't mean that people will take them up and understand them or really fully invest in them or behave in a way that's consistent with them. So it can be one of those issues.
So, as we began this conversation, the mental model conversation seemed to be around already established models that people already have. What you just said, though, makes it sound as though you can create new ones, or you can introduce a new mental model into a system and change something. Is that fair to say?
Well, that's sort of the premise of our job, right? As coaches, like we get called into places that are not behaving or not getting the results that they would hope for. And, sometimes that's technical. Like sometimes those roadblocks are technical in nature. Sometimes they are, just practices. But a lot of times they have to do with people's understanding of how is this thing supposed to work in the first place. So I think a lot of the work of a coach is to help leaders understand. Actually, if you schedule every hour of everybody every week, people have no slack. There's no slack in the system. And it's the same as you trying to drive on a highway at rush hour. Like it's actually slower. Why would that be? Let's talk about that. And then downstream of that is reducing the work in process and batch size.
So, Matt, what I think I hear you saying is our job as coaches, as you see it, is to expose an organization to other mental models if they don't already have them, because from an outsider's view, we can observe, again, limited by our own mental models, but we can observe and recommend, here, try this other mental model on for size. For example, at a pharma company, they were developing, I was working with a development team, and they were developing a mobile app. And it was a really cool app. But they were developing it purely from a developer side. So I said, show me your user story map. Or what? Well, tell me how you're getting into the head of the customer.
Who?
What?
I'm sorry. You haven't thought about that person yet.
So I said, well, hey, let's try this. Tell me what this is going to look like from a customer's perspective. Just walk me through it. And again, it's a way to try to help shift their mental model from I'm developing something, I'm busy coding, I'm busy developing, I'm busy connecting to hardware, to what's the customer experience going to be like? And it was mind-blowing for them when they realized, holy crap, we're not looking at this from the technology side. We should be looking at it from a customer side.
Yeah.
In addition to that, it shifted their mental model, and it was insightful for them. And I think it just opened up a whole new world to them.
100%. I do this training on Agile user stories, and one of the first things I have to say is an Agile user story is the story of what the user does. And it feels a little bit condescending to say that, but it's a perspective that's missing from a lot of places. The Agile user story isn't an accounting of what the development team will do during the sprint. It is the whole point of it is to put yourself in the shoes of the person from the perspective of who are going to use it. Yeah.
So if your user story says, as a product owner, first of all, it's wrong.
Why is the product owner paying money to the organization that they work for to buy this? And it's totally confused. It doesn't make any sense.
Yeah. No, that makes total sense.
Yeah.
So we've got mental models that everybody has, some of which maybe through no fault of their own may not be the healthiest of ways of looking at things. And so while as coaches, one of our jobs is to introduce new mental models, it also might be to help them recognize the ones that aren't being conducive to what we're trying to help them achieve or what they're asking for.
Totally. Yeah. So there's one more because there's a bunch. When I started to look for examples of mental models, I found a bunch of them across different places. I started with this one article on mental models for product development and, like I said, the Steve Tendon stuff. And then there's this guy named Sean Paris who does Farnham Street blog, who talks about mental models in general. And there's one that I think maybe is useful because it's sort of a meta mental model, or like, it's called The Map is Not the Territory.
Oh, I know that one.
Yeah, you've heard of it, of course.
Yeah.
And these things, because they're models, they're abstract, they might apply to multiple different disciplines. But the idea is that the map of the reality is not reality, right? Because if the map were to represent reality and all of its imperfect fidelity, right, with all the complexity, it would cease to be useful as a map. The whole point of a map is you're supposed to leave stuff out so you can focus on just the essentials. But we forget that sometimes looking at, let's say a program level roadmap about what's going to happen for the next 6-9 months, a year inside an organization. And we think that is what the next year of my life is going to look like. Yeah. And there is stuff missing in that. And
there's a lot of stuff missing in that.
Yeah. That is not the territory that we will find ourselves in 6 months. And if we lose sight of the fact that there's a difference, we set ourselves up.
Is it fair to say that one of the mistakes that we see is them thinking that the map is all inclusive, and therefore they will pack it as full as possible with visible things because their perception is that's all there is. If I don't put it in the map, it doesn't exist.
Yeah. People tend to look at roadmaps as commitments or predictions. And so if it's not there, then, one of the basic assumptions we have is that we'll renegotiate this stuff continually as we go along. And so if it's missing, we can add it. But if you're,
kind of doing it live.
So that's kind of a mental model where stakeholders view a roadmap as written in stone. This is a commitment. Where are the dates? How come there aren't any dates on here? Because I need something to hold you to.
Well, even worse, you drew them sort of on sprint boundaries. Therefore, those must be the commitments. You will get all of this feature done in this sprint, right? And then all of this.
Yeah, there's this idea of a lossy abstraction, right? You abstract out the distinguishing characteristics, and that gives you something to focus on, which is useful, but you've lost a bunch of stuff, and some of that might turn out to be essential.
Yeah. I've had occasion to work with some individuals who were quite busy. Their calendar was packed full of meetings and one-on-ones and things. So much so that if you want to talk to them, you've got to find a half-hour slot sometime in a week or more in order to even get on their schedule. And somebody made the statement, it seems like these people only ever work in meetings. Like if you want something done, the only time they ever get anywhere is if you have a meeting with them and you work with them on it through that time frame. And I kind of thought about it, and I'm like, well, that makes tons of sense, doesn't it? If they are 100% booked, their dance card is totally full, when do you ever expect them to do the work that you would have asked them to do? It's what you're essentially doing is you're getting the work done by carving some time out of their schedule in a meeting with you to do the work that you want them to do.
Yeah. A long time ago, I listened to a podcast by some people, I think it was Manager Tools, who talked about because they coach executives, and they'd go in and they would say, tell me what your priorities are. And people would say, well, I have 1, 2, 3. First of all, a lot of people had 30 priorities, so they had 0. But they would say, okay, let's say they had 3 priorities. And then the next thing they would say is, okay, now show me your calendar. And a really high percentage of the time, you wouldn't see blocks of time reserved to work on those priorities. So that's an example of a mental model that was sort of incoherent. Mm-hmm. And that would be one of the first things they'd work on, I believe.
Yeah. But if you're looking at it from, they described the culture of this organization as people work in meetings, that all meetings are working sessions.
Yeah.
I'm like, that's a symptom. That's not the culture. That's like.
Yeah. Where does the work actually happen would be my question.
Well, it depends on the kind of work. Again, you have to be careful just assuming because there are situations where people do want to collaborate and feel like they can make more progress collaboratively. And if that takes the form of a meeting, whether it's weekly, daily, or whatever, and maybe it's 3 or 4 people, and that's their regular meeting for doing the collaborative work that they need to do, then that's legit as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I was at one client where they decided that they were going to have heads down time working, that there could be no meetings scheduled in these hours.
Yeah, me too.
That was the rule, right? And I'm like, so considering every member of your team is working remotely, what is your definition of a meeting? Because when we talk about teams collaborating, when members of the team need to work together to get stuff done, because that's how we efficiently achieve things, do you consider a call between Matt and myself as a meeting if we're collaborating on getting something done?
Yeah,
and their answer was yes, no meetings. And we said, well, okay, how about we invite every member of the team to a blocked out session that is in those office hours. So basically you're protecting those hours. And if the teams need to talk to each other, they will join each other in that session to do their work, the heads down stuff that you are trying to give them space to do.
So voluntarily, spontaneously organized instead of prescribed.
Yeah. Yeah. That was the negotiated settlement, let's call it.
That first team I was on, that was awesome. We were all in one big room, and if you wanted to go talk to the senior architect, you got up and you walked 7 feet.
I know, that was so cool, but we don't get to do that anymore.
A lot of people hate it, but it's, a lot of people had headphones on, and there was a sort of a evolved culture of tap you on the shoulder, right? And, sometimes Jeff didn't want to be interrupted, but then, ultimately you had to have some face-to-face communication to work that stuff out. So it was more efficient in a lot of ways.
Yeah, we used to call them war rooms. Man, yeah, those were the days.
Yeah.
I was at one place where they would have war rooms. Like if they had a serious issue, and several of us were there, but they would bring every person who they thought was important to fixing that problem into that room.
Yep.
And they basically shut the door, and they were not allowed to leave unless they were deemed unnecessary to the fixing of that problem. But they would almost always swap them out with somebody else who had now been revealed to be the next most important person to bring in. And this was an established pattern that whenever they had a big problem, the most efficient way to solve that problem was to get the people in the room together and keep them there until they fixed the issue. And then we come in and say, hey, we're going to introduce Scrum. And they went, this seems completely unnatural. I said, why? And they said, well, you're trying to put people in a room together and have them get work done? How is that ever going to work? I'm like,
that's what they were doing.
See that room over there that you never let us use because it's the war room just in case? What do you do in that room? This is already baked into your culture. You already recognize that this is sometimes the only way to get stuff done. I'm just suggesting, what if you treated all work with that same degree of urgency without the panic part? Just, we're trying to get work done. Let's naturally get the right people in the room together and let's get it done.
Well, I mean, when it's important enough to require a violent metaphor for what you're doing, then you can just force people together. Other than that, I suppose you need a lighter touch.
It's got to have some terminology that sounds like there's a battle, a fight,
I don't know.
a fire, a flame, an explosion.
You can see the logic in it, though. It's not just dynamic reteaming, it's extremely dynamic reteaming, right? Like whatever the blocker is right now, whoever's missing, you go get them right away.
Yeah. And that's necessary because they kept scattering people. Like they would finish a project that was made up of these 6 resources who were then scattered into new projects and then they were just resources on that thing and then rescattered, and then a problem happens 3 projects back, and they got to get the band back together, and that means pulling people out of teams that have now been established in order to do that, instead of maintaining that product team for a period of time. When a problem happens in that product space, that it would naturally go to them to continue to treat it like work they need to do.
Totally.
That is a different mental model.
Have you heard of Hanlon's razor?
No.
Heard of Occam's razor?
I know.
Yes.
Occam. Good old Occam.
Occam was the guy, what was it, the simplest thing?
The simplest, yeah. What's
Yeah.
Hamlin?
Hanlon says we should not attribute to malice that which is more easily explained by stupidity. His words, not mine. But you see this in organizations, right? You know, you go in, you're like, why are they doing that to us, right? Or I can't believe they would be so mean. And maybe stupidity is not the right word, right?
Oh, but I like that.
Well.
That does, I mean, it's, but then, you know, I always prefer the
Inflammatory.
inflammatory phrasing.
Boy, Jeff
if
knew
at all
exactly what you
possible.
meant.
Yeah, just to get people's attention, and then
was
when
not
you go,
confused at
"What
all."
did you just say?" I said, "I just called you less smart."
Yeah. Mhm. Yeah. So that's another, you know, these things, once you start looking for them, they're like, you know, yellow VW bugs. They are everywhere. So first principles thinking, right? It's a way to reverse engineer complicated situations. Separating the underlying ideas or facts and do any assumptions based on them. What remains are essentials, right? Or you could just repeat, you know, you could cargo cult whatever we're already doing or whatever somebody else is doing.
Yeah.
You know, you're starting to get towards the good and the bad of these models, as I see them. I think there's value in having these models and being conscious of what those models are, and that you're thinking in a particular model. But the downside is using them as a crutch. And, I've got a new mental model here. Let's try this one out. That's good. But then when
let
you
me
get
try and
stuck
hammer that on
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. I got a new wrench. Oh, but I don't need a wrench for this particular situation. So.
Right. Totally.
Well,
Totally.
in preparation for this, you had pointed us at a mental model for product management article, right?
Yeah.
And so we had dug through that. And if you were to just go down the list of mental models identified in this, they almost don't even seem like mental models. They just seem like a list of definitions of things.
Yeah.
But the danger you would have is if you tried to apply them all, right? So,
Yeah. This is, you know, any good practitioner or artisan or whatever has a toolbox and it's stuffed full of tools. And what makes you a good practitioner is that you're familiar with all of them. You know what they're good for, what they're not good for, and you can select the appropriate one.
yeah. But was, you know, in that list, and we had this conversation not too long ago about cost of delay and something about value. I forget.
Value density, I think.
Yeah, I think that was it.
Yeah.
Yeah, value density and cost of delay. But and within that product model, there were 4 mental models that he called out: return on investment, time value of shipping, time horizon, and expected value. And they were all, you know, related, and they're all good, but you couldn't do them all. Like, you couldn't say, well, I'm gonna only focus on return on investment, and then, but I'm also focusing on the time horizon maximization. I mean, it would, maybe you could do 2, but you couldn't do all 4. It would be a little tough. Expected value was the one that threw me, because it was like map all possible outcomes, then apply a probability to each one, and then determine through a weighted average of which one of those And you're like, you know what? I don't have that much time. I don't have enough time to sit down and imagine all possible outcomes.
Well, but I mean, you could look at these as sort of lightweight sort of viewpoints that you could adopt. Not that you need to do detailed analysis, but like you could think of these as different slices or perspectives or ways to look at. And so you're right. I don't think you could use all of them simultaneously to the same extent, but you could maybe this is part of the art of product management or being a good practitioner is understanding, like I just said, what's appropriate, like which one is most important for this particular context.
Well,
but there was one. Oh, go on, Jeff.
Keep in mind that Brandon Chu, the guy that wrote the article, and he did cite using these as a lattice. In other words, he wasn't suggesting. Now he didn't get to this till the very end, and so it could easily have been interpreted as, wow, look at all these 13, 14, 15 models. I did like that he had categorized them, but it's some of them were even contradictory to each other.
Yeah.
And but I think here's the thing. He was trying to paint a context of, look at this lattice and where do these models fit in this lattice, not to imply to use every one of them, but if you were to use one or two, how would you juxtapose that against this? And does that make sense? Is this all congruent? Or are these two models incongruent? In which case, maybe it's kind of like playing a devil's advocate. But the whole idea was, at least my takeaway was, to be very judicious with this. But these are some new models to consider, or some old models to reconsider the decisions that you're making when it comes to product management.
Yeah, I get what you mean about the contradictory ones, especially when he got about talking about speed and quality.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly one of them.
Anytime it's like, well, at this point you would prioritize speed over quality as opposed to prioritizing quality.
Oh, really? Did
speed.
he say that? It was speed versus?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't notice
and
that.
I'm just like,
interesting.
Okay, I'm gonna put money down on quality is not optional, and speed is the variable that you can play with, but.
And if it was in software, you know that they're positively correlated. Speed and quality are both go up together. But if you're talking about something else, they might be inversely correlated, right?
So here I took a little different perspective because my first impression was what Mike said. Well, what are you talking about? There is nothing negotiable about quality. But then I thought about it in terms of, particularly from a startup perspective, if you're trying to build something and you're trying to get to this, minimum viable product that, we tend to talk about, probably over talk about it, but there's trade-offs. Mm-hmm. If we're trying to learn something really quickly, speed is of primary importance. And so we end up maybe shortcutting certain things which add to technical debt. Technical debt is obviously overall a bad thing, but it is useful. It is useful.
If whatever you're building is not going to live long, then who cares if there's technical debt?
Precisely.
And so as I was reading through these, I'm going, oh yeah, he's trying to do some balance between speed and quality. I don't like this at all. And then he had the one that was experiments, features, and platforms. And it was experiments are high speed, low quality. Platforms are the opposite. They're low speed, high quality. And then there's your day-to-day feature stuff where he said that there's a balance between the two. And I said, okay, now that makes a little bit more sense. If I was going to sacrifice quality, it would be in a situation where I just need to get some feedback. I need to get an answer. That's more important than getting it right the first time. Mm-hmm. So.
Totally. And so and getting to that understanding is all about the context you find yourself in, right?
Right. So your mental model tied to fast feedback, but if my mental model now has to shift to being able to support this thing in the long run, then yeah.
Yep. It's like
That
you really
works.
can't use any mental model or any tool really without knowing what are you trying to do?
Yeah.
What does good look like? What are the
There
risks?
was one he did that I really was intrigued by. It was the key failure indicator.
Oh yeah.
It was like the last one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So everyone talks about KPIs, key performance indicators, always this positive outcome you're trying to get to, right? It's like, what do we want to achieve? We want this KPI. This is how we're going to measure our success. And KFI is the opposite. They're paired together. It's I want to achieve X, but not at the expense of something else. So key failure indicator is you're either focusing on the positive outcome or you're capturing the things you're trying to avoid in
Yes.
the right.
It reminds me of
thought-
the idea of a pre-mortem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I don't until I read that I had never heard anyone talk about unintended outcomes in any of those discussions.
Yeah, I don't think I have either, actually. It was an interesting original thought
But well, maybe you have in a different
with different words.
language. So I'm sure you're familiar with riskiest assumption testing, right?
Yeah.
And so if you're proposing to develop a solution for somebody, you might have it right, but what are the riskiest assumptions? And, all of our hypotheses are just chock full of assumptions. And so what's the riskiest one? In other words, what's the one that's going to kill us the most or the fastest? And that's the one that you want to test. And that's not unlike what you're talking about, Mike. The unintended consequences. But it requires that you delve down into what is it that we're proposing, and not just see the happy path, but what are the unintended consequences? And if you
Exactly.
exercise that, you might discover some stuff that, ooh, yeah, we were assuming that. Well, yeah, we're always assuming stuff.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's where, the project managers of old are looking for risks, right? They're trying to identify all the things that might go wrong. And maybe that's where some of this stuff was surfaced in systems as a whole. But I kind of like the idea of balancing it right in those performance indicators. I think that makes a ton of sense.
Yeah, it's interesting that in some of the latest thinking I've seen about this, like Mick Kirsten's company, risks is one of the test topics.
Well, it's now
Plan view. Yeah, but if they talk about the four flow items, and one of them is risks, right? So in a way, we've circled back to it's one of those key things. They talk about features, defects, debts, and risks. I think are the four types of thing that you should have on your backlog, and risk is important enough to have its own category. Anyway.
Okay. Cool.
All right. Well, it's been some number of minutes since we started. I'm not going to tell you how many.
And we all paused meaningfully at that stage, which usually signals
Yes.
an end has arrived.
And this is the part where I say, this has been this Agile thing. I got it right finally. My name's Matt Beam.
I'm Mike Markey.
And I'm Jeff Singleton.
And that is it. We'll see you next time.
Adios, everybody.
Have a good weekend.